I have a very strong memory of asking a classmate, like, so what did they carry? And basically the answer was, it's not about what they physically carry. Oh, okay, corny. And I totally was just trusting your reading taste, because nothing about this book was like, that's my kind of story.
Yeah. A lot of trust, because, me now is like, I don't know if I trust my high school reading tastes.
I was like, these are the facts. It's like, no, these aren't.
This is not a spoiler that this book is fiction. Like, it says it's fiction on the back. It is shelved everywhere you go with fiction.
Semantics.
Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and I'm coming to you with a special and very long video, but hopefully one that you will enjoy. I am participating in sort of a reading challenge with one of my favorite buddy readers, Alex, a stay-at-home reader, and we have challenged each other to buddy read together books off of our high school required reading list. So we have both done videos kind of explaining what that challenge is going to be. We've already read our first book, and that discussion is up on her channel. I will link that in the description box below, where we talk about and share all our thoughts on A Clockwork Orange. And today's video is going to be our discussion that we had about The Things They Carried. This is a book that was on my high school required reading list, and I think that's pretty much all you need to know going into it. So you'll get to watch our full discussion with all our thoughts and our experience of rereading this novel for me, and Alex's first time reading this novel for herself, and then I'll come back at the end. All right, well, here we go. Round 2, next chapter.
Yep. So this time we're talking about The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I'm sure, yep, same copy. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's even another edition, and I actually just picked up a second one to give to my dad, because, yeah, I think he'd like this.
Yeah, I think I did see a different cover somewhere when I went to purchase mine. But I was like, no, this was the cover that I read back in high school. Mm-hmm. And so it's been the cover for a while. It might have been an anniversary edition that I saw. Mm. So I guess since it's my book, I'll just quickly introduce it. But yeah, like you said, it's The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And it's a short story collection that I think feels a lot more like interconnected short stories, for sure. They're all in the same theme. It's a compilation, if I understand correctly, of short stories that Tim O'Brien wrote about the Vietnam and the experience of men during the Vietnam War. And I'll just read a little bit from the back. So it says, they carried malaria tablets, love letters, 28-pound mine detectors, dope, illustrated Bibles, and each other. And if they made it home alive, they carried unrelenting images of a nightmarish war that history is only beginning to absorb. It's an unparalleled Vietnam testament, a classic work of American literature, and a profound study of men at war. And I thought it was interesting that on the front, the blurb from the New York Times says, marvel of storytelling, the things they carried matters not only to the reader interested in Vietnam, but to anyone interested in the craft of writing as well.
That is interesting. You had read the whole book in high school, right?
Yes.
As I was thinking about it, or like as I was reading it, I do remember being assigned this, but I think it was just the first story, like the title story. Oh. So I think we just approached it as like a one-off short story.
I could see that. I could definitely see that happening. But yeah, we read the entire thing. And as you and I were rereading it, I at one point remembered, I was like, I think I actually read this during my creative writing class, is where I got assigned it, and not during my normal English class. And I think, as we go along discussing, it'll become clear, like that connection with the writing.
The New York Times blurb is like very appropriate to your experience with it then.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And very much to what stood out to me on this read. Mm-hmm. So, all right. So should we go ahead and get to our questions that we have here to go through?
Sure. We've talked about how you read it in school for a creative writing class. I had only read that first story, or I should say I was assigned that first story because I know that I did not read it, because I have a very strong memory of asking a classmate, like, so what did they carry? Like, who had the classic period before, who already knew what was on the quiz, is like, so what did they carry? Yeah. And basically the answer was, it's not about what they physically carried.
Right, which I'm sure, as not having read the book, you'd be like, wait, what?
I'm like, oh, okay, corny, like whatever. So going into it this time, like I knew that it's not actually about what's in their bags. And so I was especially looking out for like symbolic, like evoking emotions, and something a little more philosophical than a war story.
Okay, yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think for me, I had a lot of different feelings going into this. It was a reread for me. Going into it, I knew I read it in high school. Like I said, I didn't remember which class it was in, and that hadn't even stood out to me at the time. But I did remember this being probably my favorite book that I read in high school. And I didn't totally remember why. I remember thinking some aspects of it stood out to me as being kind of humorous, but like a dark humor. And I just remember it being way better than I thought it was going to be. And I shared with you that there was like one scene in the book that I did remember really standing out to me. And I was like, I wonder if I'm going to be able to find that scene again, and if my memory of it is correct, and if I'm going to have the same reaction this time. So
we talked about when we were discussing A Clockwork Orange, how like there's almost that like fear of something like not holding up, like you're not going to be able to recapture that same feeling, or that you, in your memory, things are bigger and better than like as we are older now, are we going to have the same experience? And I totally was just trusting your reading taste, because nothing about this book was like, that's my kind of story.
Oh my God. Yeah. A lot of trust, because, me now is like, I don't know if I trust my high school reading tastes. Like, I mean, I guess in all fairness to my high school self, I have over the last 2 or 3 years read a couple of books that I read during high school, like for fun for myself. Mm-hmm. And I have still liked most of those. So I guess we were in fairly safe hands.
Okay. I guess the next thing to talk about is whether or not we had any background info or did any research going into it. And again, I kind of like to start, just dive in. And then I usually get around like a halfway point where I'm like, okay, I need more. I start, which I don't know if that's good or bad. Like, should I finish and get the experience? But like, I get distracted about halfway and I want all the information. And I will say that did change my reading experience. And I don't know if it's that, or if it was just a shift in the book itself. So I think we'll get to that. Do you remember from high school what kind of context you were given for the book?
The only thing I really recall in high school is at some point questioning whether these stories were true or not, and questioning and asking my teacher questions about Tim O'Brien and his experience with the Vietnam War. And I just remember that was like the one thing during reading the book that I wanted to know was, are these stories true? Is this an autobiography? Is this fiction? I don't know if I ever looked at the back of the book, because it definitely says it's fiction, but that's really the only memory I have going into the book this time.
And I went in with pretty much the opposite expectation. I think if an author writes a character with their own name, I can't turn that off. Like, and to me, like, he's writing his own story. I'm like, and knowing that he served in Vietnam, I read it as like, oh, well, it says it's fiction. It was probably easier to publish if he wasn't fact checking, and he probably changed names. So maybe that's why they're calling it fiction. But I was reading it as memoir or nonfiction. And like, even though the book tells you several times, like, this isn't all true, I was like adamant, like I was convinced that like there's more truth than not in it, until about the halfway point.
Okay. Yeah. So let's go ahead and get into our reading experience,
Yeah.
because I think that has a lot to do with the experience of reading, and even what you're saying in terms of, being convinced that this is like a more like autobiography or memoir. Um, I think also the narrative voice leans towards your thinking that. So get more into it. Like, what was your reading experience like throughout the book? Like you said, halfway. Like, where did you start?
So, well, like I said, I was sure that like there was more auto than fiction in this like auto fiction. Like, I was sure that he was writing from his own personal memories, and like he is, but yeah, I really wanted to believe that this was all true. And I think that's just the kind of reader I am. Like, even with a fantasy book, like I'm willing to be like, okay, this is how the world works. Like I'm so ready to believe anything the author is giving me. But in this case in particular, I was like, these are the facts. Even though he's like, no, these aren't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then I started doing some research, or searching on Google, like how much of the things they carried is true. And it brought me to an article with another author's experience, who was like, as a fiction writer, readers just kind of assume that like whatever character you give them is who the author is. And I was like, yeah, guilty. And then that brought me to a speech of his that he did he gave at a college. And as I'm listening, I was like, that's straight out of the book. And the way he was reciting it, it didn't feel like a memory. It felt like he had memorized something. So that's where I started to go, oh, this is a story, not a personal memory. And then, he ends that story and was like, none of that was true. I made all that up, but that doesn't matter. And so from that point on, and seeing more interviews with him, talking about how like, just because it's not true, like doesn't make it any more or any less real. And so that's how I started reading the stories and really appreciating what fiction can give us. Also, I think the stories in the second half definitely read more as fiction than the first ones felt very memoir-y. I think he started playing with imagining a point of view or imagining a situation from the other side. So I don't know if it's just this shift in tone or if it was me having more background on the work.
Yeah, no, I can see all of that, because I think you're right. I think he starts the book, I want to say, for a couple of stories in first person. And then as the book goes on, sometimes it's still first person, but you start to realize it's a different person. And I think there's occasions where he switches points of view in the story. Sometimes it's a third person narrator-ish. Usually you get it from a first person, but I definitely noticed there were a couple of times that I'm like, oh, I'm a different person in this first person narration. I get what you're saying. And if you guys are watching this, I will let you know that I will try and remember to put in the description box the both the article and the speech that you were talking about, so people can go and check those out. I think it's really interesting to hear your reading experience, because mine was somewhat similar, but I think the whole like fiction nonfiction thing I got over a little faster, because I like going in, I kind of remembered there being a discussion about it, and then as soon as I started reading, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I remember why that discussion came up. And then I really remembered like the outcome of it, and like all the discussions that we had about how like, no, this really is a work of fiction, and like why that feeling gets complicated, as you read the book. Because despite that, I did, especially at the beginning, like you said, I think I was really on like a roller coaster of like, no, this is definitely true. This definitely happened to him. Like, this is, and like you said, like, this is not a spoiler that this book is fiction. Like, it says it's fiction on the back. It is shelved everywhere you go with fiction. And from story one, and in almost every single story, the author reminds you, or the narrator reminds you, that it's fiction.
Yeah, he's very upfront with that. And I was still like, semantics. He had to put it as fiction, like just because he changed the names or like maybe he fudged the timelines. So
right, like the editor, the publisher, somebody's forcing him.
Like I was really stubbornly reading this as like, no, this is all real.
Yeah. And so I think because I had that previous experience of being settled on the fact that it was fiction, I was able to let it go a little sooner in my reading experience. And so I started out there, but then as I kept reading, I think the thread that I really ended up following throughout the book ended up being like this whole discussion, as the New York Times was talking about the craft of writing and storytelling. And that really started grabbing me. And like, I started out like in the book, kind of thinking about the fiction, nonfiction, also kind of being a little disturbed by like some of the storytelling, like the portrayal of the Vietnamese people wasn't always comfortable. The portrayal of one of the soldiers who is Native American, I was sometimes like, I don't know about this. I don't know about, these interactions with people. And they're not doing like good, kind, heroic things throughout this book. And I remember like hitting a point, like maybe a quarter of the way in, being like, oh my gosh, is this book really going to hold up? Years later, because I'm having moments that are making me feel uncomfortable. But then as I kept reading, as he started getting more into talking here and there about why it was an intentional choice that this book was fiction, and there's a lot of self-reflection on his own writing process and the place that storytelling and fiction has in life. And as that discussion really started to develop, I was like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing. And like, I felt that love of this book coming back. And I started to see like, this is why I liked this book in high school. This is what I thought was brilliant. And this is why we were reading it in a creative writing class.
I do remember Oprah, like kind of tearing apart the author of A Million Little Pieces, or there was a memoir that when it came out, he had taken some creative liberties with this memoir of his drug addiction. Oprah had him on the show and she just laid into him because she had felt so betrayed and he let down all these readers. And so as I got to the point where I'm like, oh, this legitimately is fiction, like I almost had like a kind of disappointed feeling. But then that second half, it did continue to explore like why or how useful fiction is, and that like even though these stories aren't true, they're still real and they're almost more impactful because they're fiction. And I really started appreciating, like you said, the creative writing element of it and the craft that the stories were written with. But
no, I remember you talking about that as we were reading. I remember at some point in like college or something, thinking about rereading it or showing it to somebody and their response being like, oh no, that book is like not in. And I remember going, what? Really? Why? And I didn't really know why, but I just noticed that the conversation surrounding the book had changed. And so when you mentioned that, I was like, that was probably what did it. Man, do people have a problem with autofiction? And I don't feel like there's as much an issue with that now, but I feel like it's because there is that word for it now and more people write autofiction now. But I'm thinking like, yeah, I don't think that was really a term back in the 90s. Like I've only recently heard that concept and idea. So I'm like, maybe people like that was like really a new thing at the time. And people were like,
yeah, I think there's more discussion or understanding that like you've got to sell a book. And so you kind of have to embellish on a story and make it readable, make it catch attention. I remember there being other books I read at that time that I've since learned that like got whatever 90s canceled is. There was one called A Child Called It, I think was like a story about a kid who was abused. And then people are like, no, he made it all up. And so now I have negative connotations with that book. And I'm like, maybe I should give that like, look at what the actual like story is behind that. Because I think there was like just a period where we were quick to like cancel authors for embellishing.
Yeah. Which getting into the themes and stuff, that's our next thing, themes, motifs, style. I think for me, again, like that was the thing that really stood out in the things they carried for me was Tim O'Brien's discussion of why his book was fiction and this idea of what we can do with storytelling and why sometimes it's almost necessary to write a real experience as fiction. And I feel like all those people who criticize autofiction like need to read this book so that they can understand some of that. Because I think before that moment, I definitely would have had moments of being like, oh, but you're lying, or you're, just trying to sell your book by like, writing it in a pretty fashion or something like that. And I would have thought, that negative reasons would have been the only reason for doing autofiction. As I followed through this book and I listened to his thoughts on storytelling and on writing fiction, I was like, oh, this is a really like deep and profound reason for writing a real life experience as fiction. There were a couple of other themes that he also discussed that really stood out to me, like the idea, like you were talking about, and your friend tried to warn you about the things they carried. And you get it very strongly in the first book. In the first story, in the first chapter, where he talks about like the things that they literally had to carry, as when they humped, when they were hiking through the jungle. Whether it was like, their water bottles, their Resec, their, MREs, whatever it was that they were physically carrying. But then he talks about all the intangible things they carried, their sorrow, their grief, their hope, their loss, their love for people, their stories. And I loved that conversation. And one of the questions that we have is there anything that we wished got explored more? And I almost want to say for me, that was one of the topics, because I feel like in the first half of the book, he talks a lot and you're constantly reminded of all the things they're carrying. But then as the story goes on, I think at first I thought it disappeared. And I realized it really didn't. It just became more subtle.
It was very subtle. And it would almost be like a little callback where I'm like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing. Yeah. Or like, it'll be something as simple as saying that like a weight is lifted. Right. And you're like, oh yeah, because they were carrying it.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
What I love about that first story that's really setting up like the idea of carrying is that as he listed physical things, like he was so specific with weight, like he was really giving you the idea of what a physical burden these soldiers were carrying. But then even the way the intangibles were described, he's somehow able to convey that was the most burdensome. That's actually the heaviest thing. Like, yes, there's a physical like weight to some things, but the things that was really the most difficult were their fears, the like bravado that they needed to put on for each other. Their loss, their memories from home, their kind of hopes or plans for the future, like all of that. Not to mention like just the constant fear of being in a strange place. Most of them probably didn't want to be there in the first place. So I think he just did a really good job at showing you something physically heavy, but then like the emotional heaviness, that's what the actual story is. His sentence length varied in a way that was like really fun to read. Like it would go from like very basic like listed items to then this like really descriptive like emotional sentence that would just kind of like take you by surprise and you're like, whoa, that was amazing.
It's particularly like when he's literally listing the things that they're carrying. He'll be like, oh, their bag, and it weighed this much, their shoes, and it weighed this much, and, their, shovel, and it weighed this much, and the metal detector, which was, super heavy, and they also carried Ghost.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd be like, whoa.
Yeah.
I did not see that coming. Yeah, it was very, very effective. I mean, he's an amazing writer, and this book is so well written throughout. And again, I'm like very impressed by how many themes get carried throughout the book. No pun intended. But like I remember there was like repeated discussions of embarrassment and this feeling of like fear of being embarrassed and getting embarrassed and embarrassing others, and how that was like something they carried more than just courage itself. Like they weren't walking around feeling courageous. A lot of them were walking around being afraid of being embarrassed or be embarrassing someone else in their lives by their behavior. And so he has this ongoing discussion of how we did things so that we wouldn't be an embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was another interesting ongoing conversation, and maybe that's one that I wanted to maybe be fleshed out more. But I did think it was something that was discussed multiple times. But yeah, there was a lot of different things that I think, because he shared so many stories, he was able to bring up from different perspectives and angles to discuss. And I thought that was really well done.
Yep. And I thought like throughout each one, they would be like in a different way in each story, but you could see like these common threads of like he's really emphasizing the youth of these soldiers, or they're kids. I think there was even like one of them who acted the most aggressive and outlandish, and like he was the craziest one of the group. He does something absolutely horrible. It's disgusting to read around animal cruelty, and then he's like, I'm just a boy. And so I think he carried that idea of like these are young people in an awful experience throughout each story. And along with that, there's this idea of innocence. I think an innocent like juxtaposed in like this war setting was really powerful. And like you said, this idea of shame, or like they're afraid of being cowards or being embarrassed. And along with that, like guilt. Everyone had guilt for one particular death, like the way he went through each kind of character, each blaming themselves. But then he also kind of comes into like this broader view that's like, here's all the different things we can blame. But none of that matters in this moment. And so I think those were like really big universal themes that he managed to weave throughout.
It's almost hard to believe that these stories were written separately and then collected into this book. And I'm sure like some of that just has to do with like how he edited it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's why it's hard, like, because I guess that was one of the things that I didn't remember about this book, is that it was actually short stories, and that this is actually a short story collection. Like in my memory, I remembered it as a novel, but I think it comes back to that idea of just how well all these things were woven together across all these stories.
Right. And the fact that he did do it so well is, I think, what surprised me, that I was engaged and enjoying a book on a war. Like that's not anything I would ever be drawn to pick up. But the way he made it so universal, and that plays back to his idea of fiction is so useful in relaying a truth.
Because it was fiction, he was able to make all these connections, where I think if you were just factually going through things, it would be a lot harder to bring out these truths and insights and experiences that he's sharing. So did you have a favorite scene or line or chapter or moment?
Yes, there was actually two that, well, just within each day of reading it, I feel like each day I would be like, okay, that's going to be my favorite scene. And the next day I'm like, okay, no, that one's my favorite part. So first of all, like I feel like it started off strong. So the first chapter or story, the things they carried, the title story, really strong start. We've talked about how I liked the sentence structures, the way he would just be really like factual and then emotional. And I think that was great. Then we read On Rainy River, and that's one where I was like, this is truly his story about, he gets his draft number gets pulled, and he's kind of like, do I go? Do I run for Canada? And it's this really emotional journey. And he told that story at the college speech he was giving, and then at the end he's like, all made up. And I was like, oh man, come on, I loved that story. I loved that journey you went on.
I know. And it is. There's like a tension between like you said, wanting to believe that these are all true. And like he really makes you wrestle with denial because I mean, like he'll say at the end of the story, none of that was true. And you're like, I don't know. But I mean, I think honestly, that's just how good a writer he is
Right.
that it's like he throws it in first person narrator and you're convinced.
And then, yeah, when you pull back and consider his point that just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it's not true, I'm sure that experience in general was very much what a lot of people were going through. So, but at the end, I think my very favorite story is How to Tell a True War Story. Because I think that's the one where he gets into like, here's what makes a good war story and what makes it true, whether or not it happened. A true war story is never moral. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. And I just liked how he was going through, like, if you feel uplifted and if you feel like, if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made a victim of a very old and terrible lie. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. And there was just something like so honest about that line that really caught my attention. And I think it does frame the book or the collection as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a part of me that almost wishes that chapter came even earlier in the book, but it's not until this chapter that he's finally like, okay, here's what I think about war stories and what a true war story is like. And if you're going to tell a true war story, because you see all of those things in his stories, and you also see the absence of things that he's like, these shouldn't be in there, because that's what his stories are like. They're not the uplifting, heroic, everything works out well, heartwarming situations. They're the brutal, ugly, realistic, no lies are told in this in terms of how it really went down, and not in terms of like how it really went down, but in terms of the experience of how it went down. Mm-hmm. And once I started understanding that clarified to me how like the parts that I was feeling like, oh, maybe this isn't holding up well, like in terms of like, the things that the characters would say to one another, that I was like, oh, that sounds kind of racist, and like different things like that. And I'm like, oh no, he's probably aware of that, and he's intentionally leaving that in, because he doesn't want you to walk away thinking that all these races came together and said kumbaya because they were all fighting on the same side and they were all going out and doing the just and right thing. Mm-hmm. And he shows you how like the war is driving these people crazy, how they're making poor decisions because they're young, how some people are forgiving them for that and others are like, nope, we think you're going slightly insane. Yeah. And like, and so you have those moments of like you mentioned, like there is some animal cruelty in here a couple of different times. And I think in other books, you could be like, wow, that's inappropriate. I don't like that. But he's more like, but this happened. And we need to, like, in a true war story, isn't going to deny the fact that this happened. and I almost felt like he was saying, and it should make us uncomfortable. A true war story should make you uncomfortable with what was going on. We shouldn't sit well with it and be at peace throughout the entire story, because if so, it's not a true war story.
Yeah, I think he was just very honest and critical throughout. So like, even like you said, some language or slurs, like as I would read them and go like, don't love it, but it didn't bother me or detract from the book, because he was so upfront with like, here's where we are, here's how things felt, this is the situation we were in, this is how people talked. He did a good job with like each of his characters really developing like where they're coming from, what's driving them, and how they're reacting to the situation. You could see everyone in a different light in that way. And so everything just made sense, because nothing was like painted over with this like nice, easy, like, taking away the harsh edges and, making everything palatable. Like there's so much honesty and truth in this fiction that I just really appreciated it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I think all the moments that you mentioned, the opening chapter being really strong, on Rainy River, where he's talking about this summer that he got drafted and how he felt, was just a really moving story, like, and heartwarming. The chapter on true war story was really important for me, because I was like, oh, okay, it's all starting to make sense. And then I think the other one, I mean, the whole book is great,
Yeah.
and all the other chapters. But I think the other one that really stood out to me as well was, the chapter called Notes. And I absolutely loved that story, because he said so many profound things about how writing fiction and how writing in general and his own process of writing, how that helped him like grieve and process the experience that he had gone through in war. And I think you see that throughout this entire book. And so for me, that was like another chapter that was just really important in understanding this book and what he was trying to do, as well as just like gave me a lot to think about the importance of fiction in general. Because like I feel like there's a lot of people who will have that nonfiction fiction debate, and it's like, well, why would you read a nonfiction about the Vietnam War when you could just, or what, rather, why would you read a fictional story about the Vietnam War when you could just read a nonfiction about it? And I think he makes an excellent case as to why fiction is important as well. So.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm someone who really only reads fiction. And yet I feel like through fiction, reading from different countries, reading from different points in history, like I do have an understanding of, cultures and motivations. And like, so fiction can do so much. And I did also like those back-to-back stories you mentioned, because you get to see someone who is struggling with not being able to talk about the experience. And then this is where it still was feeling very memoir-y, where I'm like, okay, this is still very true what he's saying. When Tim O'Brien is discussing, like, he's realizing he can't stop writing about this war, and it's his own version of therapy. He talks about his daughter calling him out for like, can't you write on a different topic? Like,
Right.
and again, it comes back to like, he's still carrying his memories. Like he's still carrying Vietnam. And so that's where you get to be like, okay, this writing fiction is for our benefit, and it's also for his.
Yeah.
So I really liked that part too. And we could just list basically all the stories.
The whole book.
Well,
like this more or less so. So let's get into
one, Was there a least favorite part? I won't say like a part I hated. There was like just a least favorite. And I think it's the one that is it The Man I Killed? I think that's the one where he is writing the perspective of one of the Vietnamese people that had died, but giving like he probably was scared of, serving, or he was feeling this way. And then he met a girl, or he went to school. And I didn't hate it. It was probably just the story I wanted to get through. I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I actually really liked that story. What kind of turned you off about it? Like, what did it just feel like irrelevant to you, or?
So, and I'm wondering if it's more because it came at the time where I had to let go of the idea that this is Tim O'Brien's truth. And like this one is very obviously not Tim O'Brien telling his own story. But I mean, I did still appreciate giving that other side of the narrative, that these are people whose country is experiencing a war. Their villages are being destroyed. Like they had hopes and futures and dreams and loves and history also. And then I like how that's reflected in like his own character basically mirrored this man who died. So it's not a bad story. I think for me, it was just the one I enjoyed the least. To me, it almost, even though it was like a new perspective and a new story, it almost felt a little bit repetitive because in other stories, there's other stories that like ended with him killing someone, or that like Kiowa, one of the other characters, is telling him like, okay, what could you do? Like you had to do it. You know, he was dead as soon as he came out. Like you're not to blame. And like, so in multiple stories, we know that he killed someone and he's kind of rocked by it. And then we're finally getting that story. And at that point, like I've already got how affected he was by taking someone's life.
Because I get what you're saying. Because I think you do get basically the same story retold 3 different times in kind of 3 different ways.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's interesting to hear because I liked it, but I could definitely see what you're saying.
They're all stories that were included in different publications, and so it makes sense that like if this is a topic he keeps revisiting, he would write it in a different way each time, but it's all kind of the same thing. And so when you put it all in one place, there were some times where I was like, yeah, we did this.
Yeah. You're starting to feel like his daughter. Dad, can't you write about something else?
How about you? Is there a least favorite?
Gosh, did I have a least favorite? I don't think I had a least favorite like story or moment. I think I just had those moments surrounding like otherness that made me really uncomfortable. That and the animal cruelty. So I think those were the things that like just the perspective on the Vietnamese people, or I feel like Kiowa was probably the only other race that was really mentioned. And so I think those were moments that made me uncomfortable. But as I understood more and more that he was trying to really portray how these characters really interacted with one another, and how they really did treat the Vietnamese people. And it wasn't to excuse any of this. Like, I don't think at any point he made it that like this was okay, or I don't even think he's like overlooking it with it because he's sitting in his own like, socially racist class and doesn't realize what's happening. Like, I think those moments are in there intentionally because he, like you said, he doesn't want to soften the edges. Like, he wants to make it clear, like, yeah, there were people in here who, did not have favorable views of this, that, or the other thing. Like at one point, like they use a lot of derogatory language towards the Vietnamese people. And he at one point does actually address that and like why at least he thinks that was happening. And he talks about that in light of a couple of different behaviors that the soldiers were doing. And, why he thinks they were sort of psychologically putting up these barriers. And he doesn't put that in there, I think, as a way to be like, so therefore it's okay. But more like, this is what war was doing to people. Or made you do to yourself, or that kind of thing, or made you do to other people. This is where that was coming from. So, but I think until those things started getting explained, like that was probably my least favorite part of the reading. Like, who likes to read about animal cruelty?
I think I had a least favorite character, and I can't remember his name at the moment. It started with an A.
I think it's like Azar. Is that
yeah.
this character? Is that this book? Or is it?
It is. I was like,
I opened up right to his name.
Yeah. Azar.
Azar. Yeah.
He was definitely like the most unhinged character. And I went through a lot just like really hating anytime he was on the page because he made me the most uncomfortable.
He was probably the one that continued to come up as being like, I don't know that I ever got to the point where I disliked him, but he was the one that I was definitely the most like, yikes, okay. Somebody really needs to process and get some help or something. So yeah.
And he's the one that had the line where like he kills an animal. Everyone's like, what the hell was that about? And he goes, I'm just a boy. And so like that line really impacted me. And yet he's probably the character I liked the least.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, and I think in that moment it's impactful because at first you're like, wow, is that how it's going to be excused? But then you see the reaction of everybody else in his group. Because it's fascinating. You have all these tense moments where people do things that you're like, that's not right. And you want the people surrounding them to say that like, hey, you can't do that. That's not right. But then you remember, like, you're in a war. Everybody's got grenades and guns on them. Are you going to really run up to that person and be like, dude, stop? What are you doing? Because there's that tension of like, everybody realizes this person's going insane in the moment. And do you want to run up to the person who's insane and has a rifle out? Probably not right now.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting tension that came up. But yeah, I didn't like him either. Like, I don't think you're supposed to. I don't know how you could. Yeah. So, all right. Well, are there any other thoughts you have about this book before we go into like, high school rereading list and ratings and stuff?
I think we've covered it all. That I like it as an examination of why fiction matters and why it is important to read fiction as much as it is to read anything else. I think there are people who kind of like poo-poo, like you only read fiction. But I think it does still help you create a worldview and empathy and understanding. And I really like how Tim O'Brien explored that, even though I wanted it to be true.
He's still on it. I mean, like, I think that's just so fascinating about this book because I struggled with that throughout the entire book too. I'm like, I went in knowing that these stories were probably not true as far as I can recall. Yeah. And then he starts to tell you that over and over and over. And I think the fact that he left in the number of times that he repeatedly says this is not true is like, I mean, he even has a whole section where he talks about like reading these stories out loud to people and how they always ask him, was that true? And how he like will tell them no. And then they'll still go on to talk to him as if they were true. And he's like, sure it is. Yeah. But yeah, I think for me, as far as like, why do I think this is taught in high school? Going from my own experience, I think it's because it gets into the craft of writing and the importance of storytelling. And so I think like for me, it could be taught in high school as part of a writing class, I think would be really profound and helpful. And I think it would also be taught in school because it gets at a time period that I think, the further and further we get from it, the less and less understanding we have of the Vietnam War or war in general. But I think, like you said, it also gets at the heart of fiction and why we read fiction. So I could almost see this being taught in a 9th or 10th grade class as like one of the first classes taught in an English class to help students understand, like, this is why we're going to spend the entire year in this class reading fictional works. So I could see that being why it would be read. Also, I think it's a more engaging story than I think would frequently be read in high school. And so I could see it in that sense also being a good book to start with to kind of get your students excited about reading because they're short stories, they're quick reads, and the second somebody starts like discussing it, you're going to draw in those couple of people who haven't started reading it yet. When somebody's like, did they really kill, did they really step in? Did this really, because people are going to start asking, did this really happen?
Yeah, and it's not one that like I think sometimes younger readers would have a hard time with like, why are these characters doing things? What are this characters' motivations, and like deep diving in like some more like elaborate works of fiction or like character studies where like this is very straightforward and these people feel very, very real. And like the whole framework of the story is like, this is why people act the way they do in a setting, in a situation. And so like, I think it's just very accessible in that way.
Yeah, and it's extremely well written.
Yeah, it's very appropriate as like an introduction to well-crafted fiction to evoke an emotional response or further thought at like a 9th or 10th grade level.
Yeah, and yeah, I think the themes, the meanings, the style of writing, you can learn a lot about literary elements in it, just in terms of like you were talking about, like, even if you were looking at something like writing style and sentence structure, like you were talking about how he has, these lists and how he uses a list in his story to then have an impactful sentence in the middle of it. I really think there's a lot that could be gotten out of it. I could see it nowadays having some struggles getting on a required reading list because there are some sensitive topics in here. There are like content things, but ironically, I feel like there's not a lot of content in here that tends to be the content that's getting books banned today. If that makes sense. Like, I don't feel like people are banning books today because of animal cruelty or because of war violence.
Yeah. I did see a video that it was I forget what channel it was, but they have like a banned book, like book club where like they highlight banned books, and this was on it, and then they interviewed him. So I know it has been flagged for like the animal cruelty and the language, but I think what might get it negative attention today is that it's not glamorizing like the soldier experience. Like I said, it's not giving that uplifting war story. He's kind of critical of why they were there in the first place without going too deep into it. Like, where he stands on the war. And I think now he is also more outspoken politically, where I could see people not wanting to have this included in a school read today.
Yeah. I think it has been banned, and it seems like it's one that goes on and off list.
Yeah.
Because of the language, the violence, all those kinds of things. And yeah, so I wish there was there probably is like one list that you could find that lists like, okay, this book is currently banned in all these places.
Yeah, I just think it would be banned or not included today for different reasons, maybe than initially.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the reasons people would ban this book would just change over time.
Yeah.
Rotate through if you were going to kick it off the list. And I think for a lot of schools, that's probably more what it would come down to, is not like an outright ban, but maybe just taking it off the reading list. So that would be interesting. All right, so shall we discuss our rating?
Yeah, I'm writing it down now because I forgot to grab a note card before.
I did too, so I'm going to do that as well.
So before we reveal the grade, I will say that there was a moment where like I was struggling with it because towards the end I started feeling like things were getting repetitive. And I think you brought up, it felt like this book could have ended on 3 different stories. And yet each one like had a part in the book, but it almost seemed like there was a story ending, there was a deeper meaning ending, there was an emotional like place, like it could have ended different ways, where like it kept going like, oh, there's more. Like I would finish a story and go, oh, there's another one. And so that made me kind of like question where I was going to end up with my rating.
But... Yeah, no, you're right. I do recall that because we talked about like the very last story. And I remember my feelings on it were that I was like, I liked the ending of the last story and that being sort of the line that the book ended on, but I didn't feel like the book needed the whole last story. I could have had it end like in the story before that or the one before that. Yeah. So I don't know that I took that into consideration with my grade though.
Okay.
Okay, so shall we show our grades?
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
did I actually grade something higher than you did?
Yeah, I guess so. So I mean, it's a 5 out of 5 stars if we're going Storygraph rating.
Yeah, same.
But yeah, you get that extra little plus from you.
A little plus.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think for me, I would give it more than just an A, just because even though I feel like the ending was kind of like, just end the book already. Like, I still feel like if I took those last like one or two stories out of the book as individual stories, I
Yeah.
still think they're really good
Yeah.
stories. I just would have, as an editor for this book, ended it sooner. But I just think that each of the individual stories has so much to add, and that as a collection as a whole, they work so well together. That yeah, I don't know, it's an A plus for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess you gave your reasons why you gave it just an A.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it's an A plus. I think the report card we're using only has like solid letter and then minus. Like the scale doesn't have an A plus.
Oh,
But
okay.
at 5 out of 5, it's 100%. So
Yeah. Well, we'll go based off of our report card. So then in that case, it would be an A for me as well.
yeah.
Final thing, further reading. Does this read like any books to you? Are there any that you would recommend based off of reading this? Does it make you want to read something similar, opposite to it?
I have a whole list of things I want to read now. But I will say, in terms of like read alikes, while we were in it, there's 2 stories that were like kind of bananas. Enemies, and then right after that is Friends. And as I was reading it, it made me think of Lord of the Flies, which I've never actually read. Like, I have started 2 or 3 different times and have not been able to get through. But there was something about just like, here's boys isolated in a hostile environment acting insane. And so that's what it made me think of. And just that idea of like youth and the environment they're in and aggressions and just like acting in ways outside of the norm made me think of Lord of the Flies a few times.
Yeah, I could see that. I don't know that I had any books that I felt like this read like. But I do feel like there were books that I could think of that felt similar to me in that autofiction area that I've read before. Like we mentioned A Million Little Pieces. I don't think these books read similar at all, but to me, like when I think of that blurring of the line between fiction and nonfiction, that's a book that pops to mind. The other book that pops into my mind is The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer. And I also read that in high school. And all 3 of these books are books that I never remember if they're nonfiction or fiction. And I always have to look up, and I always find them in fiction and go, oh, really? Oh, okay. So in that sense, they all read similarly to me. So share this TBR.
Yeah. Well, and then in writing style, I feel like I was reminded a little bit of Steinbeck, and like he can really describe a place really well. Like it's very visual, the environment. So I like that. And I feel like I kept seeing him compared to Hemingway, which I've only read Old Man and the Sea. So, and I don't think that's the one to compare between them. But so now on my TBR that I built off of this book, In Our Time is the Hemingway book that I keep seeing referenced like as being similar to this one, but World War I experience compared to the Vietnam experience. But for someone who says I wouldn't pick up war books, I have All Quiet on the Western Front and The Red Badge of Courage. Like sitting on my shelves, I'm like, maybe that's where we go next. And then I want to read more Tim O'Brien.
Fair. That's fair. Yeah. So I think for me, I'll start with Tim O'Brien. I definitely think I want to try more of him. I forgot just flat out how good a writer he is. Like, I think if nothing else, whether you liked each story or not, they're so well written. Like his writing style is so clear, so approachable, and his imagery is so rich. Like I was there on the rainy river with
Yeah.
that old man. I went fishing in this book.
And cried in a boat. Yeah. No, I felt
right. Yeah. Like, I mean, he talks about how he's made it fiction because he's really trying to get you to experience something. Oh yeah, I experienced like every story he laid out. I experienced. I felt it. Like I was in his school. I sat in at a desk with him. So I definitely want to try another book of his. I think the other thing that really came to mind is it really made me more curious about autofiction. So I really want to read more autofiction or books that sort of blur that line between nonfiction and fiction. So not necessarily books that are based off of like, this is a fictional account of like a true story, but like somewhere in there. So it has made me want to reread A Million Little Pieces. I have been thinking about reading Executioner's Song for a while and really couldn't decide if I wanted to do that. And now after reading this, I'm like, yep, nope, I want to do that. And then I've kind of gone down a little rabbit hole. There is another book called Ha, a Self-Murder, which is like a whole super complicated story surrounding this guy self-murdering, if you will. I don't even know if I'll be able to use that term when I edit this video. And that book is
unaliving, right? Is that how that's how we have to
okay. Yeah. So it's a book about this guy self-unaliving. And I mean, it's not something to joke about. Like it's a true story.
It's the way you have to use language now is
ridiculous. But it's a story that blurs the line between nonfiction and fiction and is retold in a sort of auto-fiction documentary style. And so that's another like area that I'm really interested in terms of like different formatting of ways of telling stories and like writing almost a documentary that's based on real life but set in fiction. So all of those things are kind of coming together. And one of those books may be on its way to me right now.
Oh, interesting.
I guess that is it. That was great.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you for putting this on our list. Because like I said, I would not have picked this up on my own. And yeah, obviously I did love it. So,
yeah. Well, and I'm glad we're doing this challenge because honestly, I don't know that I would have reread this book anytime soon because it wasn't until we did this challenge that I even went out and bought myself another copy. And I have to say that because as we were reading it, I talked it up to my son. He went out and bought himself a copy.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Because he loves writing and he is a big military history person. And so I'm like, this you need to read this. Like this is gonna be you one day writing your story about things. So okay, well, I'm gonna stop the recording and then we can. All right, so that's it. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Leave a comment below. Let me know if you have read this book before yourself or if you're now interested in reading the book. And yeah, thanks for sticking in there. I know it was a long discussion, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it as much as I did and as much as Alex did. And stay tuned. Our next book is Ragtime. And oh my gosh, I don't even know if we're going to be able to like publicly talk about anything regarding this book. We are just starting it. I'm about 100 pages in and oh, do I have thoughts. That book is off of Alex's reading list, so we'll be over on her channel. So make sure to like and subscribe on her channel as well as mine so that you can keep seeing how these discussions go. That's it for today. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.